Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out about people and how they live. Today we're going to travel to Florence in the 17th century to meet Artemisia Gentileschi, a brilliant female Florentine painter, probably best known for her vivid use of color and her portrayal of often violent and gruesome biblical scenes. She painted mostly in the Baroque style, as was the custom in those days, and for the most part stuck to biblical stories or historical heroines, women like Cleopatra, for example, often portraying strong, virtuous, and wronged women. To understand much of the body of her work, you need to know just a little bit about her. In her day, she was well known, appreciated, and in demand. She left behind at least 60 paintings, only 45 or so of which have been positively identified. After she died, her work fell out of favor. Historians tell us it was because her naturalistic style of painting fell out of fashion, although it's reasonable to assume that being a woman in an age when women weren't allowed to purchase their paint without a husband's approval might have had something to do with it. It was only in the latter half of the 20th century that her work became known again. Artemisia was born in Rome and worked in Rome, Florence, Venice, Naples, and even London for some of the richest, most influential leaders of European society, including the Grand Duke of Tuscany, the Medici family, Philip IV of Spain, and Charles of England. Like her male counterparts, she moved around quite a bit, not just chasing commissions, but perhaps trying to escape bad memories. Her father was Orazio Gentileschi, a painter who specialized in human figures, and at the time was working in Rome with a better-known landscape painter named Agostino Tazzi. They made a pretty good team. Agostino handled the landscapes, and Orazio put in the figures. Orazio tutored his daughter, and she worked in his workshop. Her earliest signed portrait was one of Susanna and the Elders, dating from 1610. Orazio recognized her talent for portraiture and hired his former associate, Tazzi, to tutor her in the fine points of adding landscapes and backgrounds. In 1611, Tazzi raped her, afterwards promising marriage. He reneged on the deal some months later, possibly because he already had a wife. Eventually, Orazio sued him. Artemisia was tortured during the trial to guarantee her truthfulness. Tazzi was convicted and sentenced to exile, but the sentence was lifted, and the next year he went free. After that, perhaps, Artemisia's understandable rage came into full view. Just after the trial, Artemisia's father married her off to a Florentine painter named Vincenzo Statizzi, and the pair moved to Florence. She was out from under the thumb of her father, but now under the thumb of a new husband, who profited from the association and also gave her 5 pregnancies in 5 years. Sadly, only one daughter survived to adulthood. After the last pregnancy, she began a passionate love affair and 3 years later separated from her husband. She spent the rest of her life and career floating about looking for commissions and patrons. She died in Naples and was basically forgotten after that. The self-portrait you see here dates from 1615, in which she portrayed herself as the martyred St. Catherine of Alexandria. St. Catherine was tortured by the Romans, much as Artemisia had been. Let's take a look at some of the rest of the art that this painter managed to produce today on The Armchair Traveler. Artemisia, like most artists, didn't paint just for pleasure. She painted on commission and needed to be paid. Paint was expensive and she was not rich. Here we see 3 versions of the same biblical scene, showing us the beginning of the story of Susanna and the Elders. The story was not included in the Protestant Bible, although it would have been well known in mostly Catholic Rome, where the first version was painted, as well as in Florence and Venice. The story goes like this. Susanna was the beautiful, virtuous wife, apparently of a fairly wealthy man. She went into a gated and walled garden to bathe. Then her maid departed. The maid admitted 2 old men into the garden. Susanna is shown here looking to see the 2 men leering at her. They demanded sex. She refused. The men threatened to ruin her reputation by falsely accusing her of adultery, a crime that was punishable by death. Eventually, Daniel, a wise young Hebrew man, questioned them separately, and the details of their stories didn't match. The conflicting stories revealed the lie of their testimony, thus clearing her name. There is a shocking symmetry between the Old Testament story and what happened to Artemisia in real life. In the Bible story, the maid was faithless. This part of the story might have appealed especially to Artemisia, who found herself in a similar position, either while she was executing the 1610 version or shortly thereafter, when the maid heard her scream as Agostino Tazzi, tutor, sexually assaulted her. The maid did nothing to help. In the oldest version, dating from when she was living in Rome with her father, around 1610 to 1612, Susanna is clearly horrified, turns her head, and looks away as she tries to push the men away. The men are shown whispering. Perhaps this was the proposition, although it might well have been the threat. There's some sky in the background, but nothing I'd call landscape. X-ray examination when this painting was cleaned apparently showed that there were significant changes made in the placement of her body, perhaps at the suggestion of her father, who was best known for painting figures. The second version in the center dates from Artemisia's time in Florence, around 1622, and seems more wistful or perhaps hopeful in nature. What we see here is a realistically proportioned woman at the edge of a pool beside a small fountain. The two creeps are leaning over the wall and leering at her. Susanna in this case looks upward, perhaps pleading to the heavens for rescue, and attempts to cover herself up with her arms in the chemise. There's also far more extensive background here, featuring trees, clouds, and blue skies. On the right, and dating from 1652, is an enormous painting. It measures 7 feet from side to side on the same theme. Artemisia was around 60 years old and nearing the end of her career when she executed, or perhaps mostly designed, this work. He had a pupil named Onofrio Colombo, and I wonder how much of this is actually his work. In this version, we still see the two creeps, but this time, instead of trying to hide shame or hide her body, she's shown pushing the men away, perhaps in disgust. This painting was only recently identified as Artemisia's work when it was restored. They found faint tracings of her signature during a cleaning and restoration project that took place in the early 2000s. Here are two versions of Artemisia's vision of Judith and the faithful maidservant, Abra, dealing with Holofernes. Inclusion of a faithful maid in each case, not just observing, but actively assisting, likely stemmed from the allegation that when Artemisia herself was assaulted, the maid stood by silently. Perhaps these images were meant as a rebuke or a lesson on how the maid should have behaved. The story of Judith and Holofernes is told in the Book of Judith, a 2nd century text which is now considered apocryphal by both the Jewish and Protestant traditions. The story goes like this. Holofernes was an Assyrian general whose army is about to destroy Judith's home city. He sees Judith and is overcome by lust. She wants to help save her city and her people. He invites her into his tent with the object of sating his desire, but instead, or during the process, she gets him drunk. Afterwards, while he's mostly passed out on his own bed, Judith picks up his sword and lops off his head. She has help here, as you can see in both versions, her faithful maidservant, Abra. These women aren't fooling around. They have their sleeves rolled up, and we see the Holofernes is actually woken up and is apparently trying to fight them off. The painting on the left dates from 1612, or after she was sexually assaulted by Agostino Tazzi. The version on the right dates from about 8 years or so later and is in the Uffizi Gallery. As you can see, they're quite similar to one another, and I suspect she used the same cartoon or preliminary drawing for each. The colors in the version on the left are brighter compared to the version on the right. On the left, we can see Judith wearing a cobalt blue dress with trim. Abra has on a red gown. The later version, which I think of in my head as the Uffizi Judith, shows a similar scene, but one with an interesting and documented after-history. The Uffizi Judith was commissioned by Grand Duke Cosimo II de' Medici, who was responsible for art patronage at the Medici court, and who was at the time one of Artemisia's patrons. Cosimo must have seen the other version and commissioned a copy for his wife. A later Grand Duchess apparently either disapproved or was horrified by the gore and had the painting banished to an isolated part of the Uffizi Gallery in a corridor between it and the Pitti Palace. Here the painting was basically hidden until 1993 when a terrorist bombing of that corridor damaged it. After restoration, the painting was exiled again. However, since then, the evaluation of her life and work have undergone a sea change. Now it's featured considerably more prominently. If you look back at the initial painting I showed you in the introduction to our visit, it's pretty clear that Artemisia painted her own face onto Judith. I've read that in every version she rendered the face of her assailant as Holofernes. Artemisia painted secular scenes as well as biblical, and did so from the very beginning of her career. She apparently either used herself or someone with similar features as her models. On the left, we see her depicted as a lute player. The painting dates from her time in Florence after her marriage, probably around 1615, and was created on commission for the Medici family. After being ignored and mostly forgotten for 400 years, I suspect PhD dissertations are now busily being typed up with her as the topic. And I suppose no one could get a doctorate in art history with Artemisia as the main topic without some pretty wild discussions of what these paintings are supposed to represent. That's fair enough, and I'm neither an art historian nor a specialist. I see a pretty young girl in a brightly colored dress, obviously familiar with and playing a lute. We know Artemisia was a painter. I like to think she might have been a musician as well, since she also painted herself in the role of Saint Cecilia, who is the patron saint of music, and holding a lute. I can claim with a straight face that I have as much justification for that interpretation as the next talker. The other talkers have far wilder interpretations. One, I can't remember where I read it, suggested that the headscarf and dress represents a Romani woman, generally slurred in our time as gypsies. Another jumps to the conclusion that what we see here is a prostitute. I suppose anything is possible, but can't fathom why the Medici family, which commissioned this portrait, would pick either topic. On the right, we see a second self-portrait, this time with Artemisia in the role of the allegory of painting. The painting was produced during her stay in England between 1638 and 1639. Here we see an extremely practical and plausible portrait of a hard-at-work painter, wearing a green smock to protect her clothes, her hair a bit untidy, and sporting an extremely odd ornament. Artemisia is wearing a locket or a pendant on a fairly long and bulky chain, one which would have swung about as she worked. When I enlarged that portrait, it proved to be a death head or possibly a mask. As I'm sure is happening with all of her work, this is likely being analyzed almost to death. What does the mask, which I'll call it, represent? I don't know. Is it a hint of the mask that she presented to the world? A better historian than I will have to tell you. Assuming I'm correct about the lute player, Artemisia's paintings of herself as masters of various arts was a bold statement for a woman at the time. These roles were typically taken only by men. I promised when we began this video that I'd circle back to Artemisia in the role of St. Catherine of Alexandria, and here she is. Catherine was one of those numerous virtuous virgins of early Christianity who ended up being tortured for her faith. The story goes that she was the daughter of King Costus of Alexandria, which was in her time under Roman control. She may even have been a real person born around 287 AD, although the first stories about her weren't written down until the 600s. The story goes that she converted to Christianity, was extremely smart, and an excellent talker. She converted apparently hundreds of Alexandrians to the Christian faith, one which was not shared by the head of the Roman Empire. When Emperor Maxentius and his government began persecuting Christians, and probably anyone else who defied them, she went to the emperor and spoke to him about his cruelty. The emperor decided to summon a group of 50 philosophers and scholars to argue with her, thinking she'd be a pushover, but Catherine, several of her adversaries, conquered by her eloquence, declared themselves Christians and were at once put to death. Maxentius was not amused. He had her locked up, tortured, and starved. While she was locked up, the story goes, she was fed by a dove from heaven, and also it's claimed that Jesus visited her, telling her to fight on and be brave. He promised her a crown of everlasting glory, which you can just make out at the top of this painting. During her imprisonment, more than 200 people apparently came to visit her, including Maxentius' wife, Valeria Maximilia. All of them converted to Christianity, and he had them all killed. Clearly, jail, torture, and starving were going to make Catherine cave in, so Maxentius decided to try something different. He asked her to marry him. She refused. At that point, used to getting his way and entirely fed up, Catherine was probably about 17 years old at the time. A furious emperor condemned Catherine to death on a spiked breaking wheel, which you can see in this photo. But when they tried to tie her to it, it broke. Maxentius then ordered her beheaded. Catherine was an important figure in the Middle Ages. She is the patron saint for a list of people and professions that is quite long, but the most obvious ones are anyone who works with a wheel, like a potter, a spinner, a knife sharpener, a miller. She's also the patron saint of the dying and unmarried girls. This particular painting has an interesting after-story. We've already discovered that Artemisia recycled not just her subject matter, but on some occasions the basic drawings in which she designed her paintings, like the two nearly identical versions of Judith and Holofernes we looked at earlier. The same thing happened here. There are two very similar paintings. This one, now in the National Gallery of Art in London, and a second still in the Uffizi. This painting disappeared from public view until the 1940s, when it emerged in a listing of contents of a will. Eventually, the family that owned it decided to put it up for sale. Estimates were that it might fetch as much as £300,000. The gallery really wanted the painting and managed to persuade some of its extensive Rolodex of American supporters to chip in for the purchase price. If the gallery thought it was going to get a bargain, it was sadly mistaken. When the final hammer dropped, they ended up shelling out £3,600,000 for this lovely painting. I'll leave you with this piece of art. I will leave you with this piece of art and an artist who is only now again finally being appreciated for her talent and ability.